He first handed the wine bottle to the woman across from him, testing John Jensen's attitude. Once he was certain that her husband wouldn't dare to confront them, he began to escalate his behavior. Not only did he verbally humiliate John, but he also provocatively slid his hand into the woman's dress.
Such a warm little flower. Don't do that. You threatened me. No, I'm telling you to get your hands off and behave. Kinda sounds like he's threatened.
John Jensen tried to reason with him, but the other man, already harboring ill intentions, wouldn't listen. With a black revolver aimed at his head, John could only watch helplessly as his wife was taken away and humiliated in front of him. But everyone has their limits, especially with his son present. So, he spoke to his wife in their Danish hometown dialect, instructing her to bite the man's ear. Then took the opportunity when the man was distracted to counterattack. Not wanting to shed blood on their first day reunited as a family, he had his son pick up the gun from the ground to make a plan. This decision became his lifelong regret because his inexperienced son accidentally blocked his father's line of fire when he stood up, giving the man a chance to seize him with a knife. The hard-earned advantage was lost in an instant due to John's moment of mercy. The man gave John 5 seconds to get out of the car, and even the normally unyielding tough guy found tears welling up in his eyes. Even a hardened warrior, used to living on the edge, lost his ability to resist at that moment. Kicked out of the car by the thug, John Jensen, worried for his wife and son, desperately chased after the carriage along the road. Even knowing he could never catch up to a horse on foot, he didn't give up. After running along the road for an unknown amount of time, the exhausted John Jensen saw a body lying in the distance. A terrible premonition surged through him. Rushing over, he saw that the body on the ground was indeed his own son, born and meeting for the first time. The two were now separated by death. At this moment, no matter how much sorrow and regret he felt, it was all in vain. So, he had no choice but to pick up his son and continue walking along the road. Not far ahead, he saw the carriage he had been chasing. The coachman had been killed by those two thugs and dumped by the roadside. Hearing his wife's screams piercing the quiet night, John Jensen suppressed his heartache, carefully laid his son on the ground, picked up the gun beside the coachman, and after confirming it was loaded, quietly approached the carriage. When he saw one of the thugs on the other side of the carriage keeping watch, he didn't hesitate to shoot out the lantern, startling the horses. As the thug poked his head out, John shot him between the eyes. The other thug, realizing something was wrong, barely had time to pull up his pants before he was shot by John Jensen while fleeing toward the woods. The previously arrogant thug, driven by a strong survival instinct, shouted for mercy, begging John to spare his life. But the grief-stricken and vengeful John wouldn't listen. It wasn't until he emptied the magazine that he had to face the reality of losing his wife and son. Seeing the tragic state of his wife in the carriage, John Jensen's 10-year dream shattered into pieces. For 10 years, he had struggled alone in America to provide a better life for his family, only recently acquiring land of his own. What was supposed to be a family reunion turned into a tragedy because of his momentary mercy. Even worse, danger was slowly approaching him. It turned out that the thug who violated his wife had an older brother, the local gang leader. Unable to find his brother's killer, Henry Delero demanded that the town's mayor and sheriff take responsibility, asking them to choose 2 people to be buried with his brother. Otherwise, he would take 4, to maintain the town's peace. They decided to sacrifice the oldest man in town first. The grandson was unwilling, but the opponent was too powerful. He could only watch helplessly as they took his grandmother's life. After sacrificing the elderly, 2 detectives drove a legless farmer to serve as the second offering. They thought the matter would end with these concessions. However, Henry Delero, still unsatisfied, pulled out his gun and randomly killed another person. His reasoning was that the dying old man and half a man only counted as one person, and such a choice was disrespectful to him. So he decided to double the town's protection fee from $80 to $160 a month until the culprit was caught. In fact, his true intention in terrorizing the townspeople was because oil had been discovered in the town. Capitalists had commissioned him to help acquire the town's land, giving him an excuse to continuously trouble the townspeople. At the same time, Peter Jensen, who had agreed to have dinner with John Jensen the next day, saw the front door of John's house wide open but with no signs of activity. Thinking the house had been robbed, he carefully entered with his gun to check. It wasn't until he saw the 2 bodies inside that he understood everything. Men don't need many words to comfort each other. With Peter Jensen by his side, John Jensen finally relaxed his tense nerves and couldn't hold back his tears. With Peter Jensen's help, John Jensen buried his wife and son. He still didn't know that, not far away in town, the killer's widow was also holding a funeral. Henry Delero promised to find his brother's killer and said he would take care of his sister-in-law from now on. But Madeleine, using her grief as a reason, signaled him to shut up because she was well aware of Henry DeLaro's dirty thoughts. At the same time, John Jensen, along with Peter Jensen, drove their carriage to town, filled with regret. However, since time couldn't be turned back, they decided to sell their property and leave this sorrowful place. During this process, John Jensen was recognized by a couple, because on the day he was kicked off the carriage by the thugs. This couple was sitting opposite his family of 3. To avoid paying the increased protection fee, the woman pushed open the door to the police station, while John Jensen had already found the mayor, deciding to sell his land. But the price offered by the mayor was half of the usual amount. It was then that John Jensen learned from the mayor that the thug who violated his wife was Henry DeLaro's brother. Because of this incident, the protection fee increased, making the town unable to afford the purchase. To avoid unnecessary trouble, John Jensen reluctantly signed his name on the transfer contract. After taking advantage of John Jensen, the mayor kindly reminded him to hide his money in his boot. However, as John Jensen was about to leave, he noticed something was wrong. The entire street was suddenly deserted, and 3 armed men were slowly approaching from a distance. He thought it was a coincidence, but when he mounted his horse to leave, he realized these men were coming for him. Every exit was guarded, so he quickly turned and rushed into an alley, only to find it was already an ambush, trapped with no way out. His horse was shot by the sheriff and fell to the ground, leaving John Jensen with no escape. Shortly after John Jensen was brought to the police station, Peter Jensen was also captured and brought in. For some reason, the detective beat Peter Jensen before locking him up. It wasn't until John saw the face of the detective who returned with Peter that he suddenly understood everything. He promptly admitted that he had killed the thug and that Peter had nothing to do with it, pleading with the sheriff to release him. However, the sheriff insisted on detaining him for assaulting an officer. The next day, Henry DeLaro sent a group of his men to town to meet John Jensen. Under everyone's gaze, they tied up John's hands and feet and took him away. Unable to bear the sight, the widow of the man John had killed turned and left. The woman who had snitched felt ashamed and hung her head after learning what had happened, while the other townspeople only watched coldly, not daring to speak up. Upon being taken back to the camp, John Jensen quickly met Henry DeLaro and the thug's wife. Not wanting his wife and son's memory to be further disgraced, he painfully recounted the events.
Your beloved husband killed my 10-year-old son. And he raped my wife. No one asked you to talk.
The Madeleine knew well enough what kind of man her husband was, so she merely glanced at John Jensen before turning to leave, not demanding the death of the man who had protected his family. Henry DeLaro, still pursuing Madeleine, decided to spare John Jensen's life for the time being. As the scorching sun beat down, the afternoon arrived quickly. John Jensen was surprised to see the mayor there and even more surprised when the mayor's first words were, "Can I have his boots?" The mayor was the only one who knew that John Jensen had hidden the money from the land sale in his boots.
You won't believe these, my friend. Not where you're going.
At the same time, the chapel in town was calling the townspeople to attend their weekly prayer service, leaving only the deputy to guard Peter Jensen. The deputy's face was still bruised from Peter's resistance, and now he had to endure Peter's sarcastic taunts alone, under the barrage of verbal abuse.
I'm sure your whore mother sounded like a mule when you were conceived.
Even the deputy, who knew it was a trap, couldn't endure it. That night, after an intimate encounter with Madeleine, Henry DeLaro promised to take her away once the task of acquiring the town was complete. He believed he had won over the woman who couldn't speak because her tongue had been cut out by Native Americans, completely unaware of the uninvited guest downstairs. Not long after, one of the patrolmen noticed the oil lamp at a fixed point swaying, but the guard was nowhere to be seen. By the time he drew his weapon and approached slowly, discovering the guard already dead, it was too late. Taking advantage of the other patrol team's absence, Peter Jensen quickly cut the ropes binding John Jensen and carried him to a hiding spot. When the patrol team returned, Peter swiftly dealt with them. By the time Henry DeLaro and his men realized what was happening, Peter was already escaping on horseback with John Jensen in the pouring rain. But Henry DeLaro couldn't tolerate anyone challenging his authority right under his nose. During the escape, John Jensen, still unconscious, kept falling off the horse. Realizing they would eventually be caught, Peter decided to hide John in a pile of rocks and lead the pursuers away himself. The next day, John Jensen finally woke up from his coma after being exposed to the sun all day. He didn't care about the cleanliness of the groundwater and scooped it up to drink. Just then, he heard the sound of approaching horses. Quickly, he hid behind a rock with his gun. As the horses passed by, he couldn't resist taking a look. That single glance felt like a knife to his heart. Peter Jensen was being dragged along the ground with his feet bound. Having lost his family less than 4 days ago, John Jensen now lost his best friend. Determined to make the thugs pay, John returned to the camp. where Henry DeLara faced his own trouble. His guards were shot, and his safe was emptied of cash. Only Madeleine knew the combination, and she felt relieved as the train started moving. She thought she was finally free from the bandits to live her own life, but her relief was short-lived as DeLara's men soon caught up with the train, forcing it to a halt. The desperados drove Madeleine to desperate measures. She ran while loading her gun, trying to secure one last chance for herself. However, someone was already lying in wait. It wasn't long before Madeleine was dragged back to the camp. Despite his affection for her, Henry DeLara feared being killed by her someday. A man nearby remarked that it would be a waste to discard such a beautiful body. To appease his loyal men, Henry DeLara reluctantly decided to offer her to them. Meanwhile, John Jensen was rescued by a farm woman whose husband had been killed by Henry DeLara. After a day of recovery, John Jensen quietly appeared behind the mayor, retrieving his boots. John had no intention of sparing the mayor, because everyone referred to the thugs by their last name, Henry DeLara. After confirming John Jensen's location and the patrol routes, Peter Jensen disappeared into the rainy night, but the mayor called him by his first name, Henry, a term of endearment used only among close acquaintances, indicating a secret between them. So, John forced the mayor to open a coffin and lie in it. When the mayor refused, John beat him. Ignoring the mayor's pleas, John locked him in the coffin. Only then did the mayor confess to cooperating with Henry DeLara to acquire land. After learning the truth, John Jensen went to the grocery store to buy weapons, since the quantity exceeded personal use. Wojciech Borowski guessed John was planning revenge against Henry DeLara and decided to join John's cause for the sake of his grandmother. By daybreak, Henry DeLara received a coffin at his camp, with the mayor's body inside. He knew it was John Jensen's challenge, but when he turned around, he saw flames rising at the camp's entrance. This was Wojciech Borowski's doing. Having decided to team up with John Jensen, his task was to draw the bandits' fire and buy John some time. Once John successfully set the barn on fire, Wojciech would escape on horseback. Meanwhile, John had already found a place to hide across from the barn. Taking down the thug who came to fetch the horses was the second step of his plan. What he didn't expect was that Wojciech Borowski, instead of escaping, would return with kerosene and climb to a vantage point. Wojciech managed to hit one enemy, but his movements were heard by the thugs below. Wojciech died in a hail of bullets while trying to help. Before dying, he spilled the kerosene, which landed on the thug who shot him. The thug's cigarette ignited the kerosene. The struggling thug set the remaining building on fire, just as John Jensen reached the building's exterior. Seeing a thug holding Madeleine hostage, John didn't hesitate and aimed directly at the thug's head. Pulling the trigger, John's position was revealed, and a thug on the ground shot him in the leg through the wall. Finding John Jensen's rifle under the floorboards, the thug thought he had John cornered, but this was also part of John's plan. John had moved to the other side of the corridor. Using a knife, he silently took out the last thug. However, Henry DeLara, hiding in the shadows, had already targeted John. Admiring the man who single-handedly decimated his gang, Henry prepared to kill John. Just then, a gunshot rang out from the side. It was his brother's widow, Madeleine, whom he had kept as his possession. With Madeleine's help, John quickly got up and, drawing his pistol, delivered the final blow to Henry DeLara. After it was all over, the town's sheriff arrived with his men, intending to claim the victory. They tried to take Madeleine away, but John and Madeleine, having saved each other, stood united. Acknowledging John's ability to single-handedly take down an entire gang, the sheriff reluctantly left with his men, and this pair of bitter lovebirds who have just met, after making sure of each other's eyes, decided to leave this sad place together as a pair, and go together to find a shelter that belongs to them. Narration is no substitute for the original movie. A good movie deserves your full attention. Thank you for seeing it through to the end. I am Movie Lover. Please subscribe to my channel and we'll see you next time.